Hello, everybody, and welcome to Do Your Research. I'm Michael,
And I'm Carl.
and this is a podcast.
That it is.
Carl, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well, Mr. Michael. It has been far too long since we've sat down to do one of these.
It has been a minute. It's been a minute. The world's been, I guess, kind of slowly coming back to a sense of normal. We have a new president. His name is Joe, and he doesn't tweet every 5 minutes and yell about Mexicans, which is
I
great.
mean, heck, when there was a terrible winter storm in Texas, even though Texas didn't vote for him, he didn't even choose to insult Texas or threaten to withhold aid. And he didn't even really have a press conference to show that he was signing the aid. He just,
Yeah,
did the job that we elected him to do.
it's a nice change. We still
Yeah.
we still have a global pandemic that we're dealing with, but we have a vaccine, and
Yes.
I think both of our parents now have at least received the first dose of the vaccine. Is that right?
Yes, my folks were just last week. In fact, my sibling and my sibling's fiance also got their first doses yesterday.
That is awesome. That's the same vaccine that we talked about in a previous podcast.
Indeed, it is.
Yeah,
Indeed, it is. Plug the
plug.
channel. Go listen if you're interested.
Yeah, that was a
Oh,
good
all of our
episode.
listener.
That was a great episode. That was one that I refer back to tell people, hey, don't be afraid of the vaccine because we spent a lot of time researching it and it's awesome. You should get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll say it again. But
Yeah, it is awesome. I will be getting it as soon as I can.
me too, buddy. Me too. And that can't come soon enough because summer's coming. Shows are starting to get rescheduled. I've got a whole series of Broadway shows that have now been rescheduled, so I feel like there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to actually maybe being able to travel and see people
Oh,
that I enjoy spending time with physically instead
yes.
of just. I mean, thank God for modern internet and connections and whatnot, but,
Yeah.
it's not the same as being able to play a board game.
No, it's not. Or maybe being able to do this podcast in person sometime. That'd be great.
Ooh.
I would love it.
Ooh.
But Carl, today we're here to talk about a little something that a series of events, I guess you could say, that culminated on early January of this month. And I think if you're ready, I think we should dive into this thing.
I think let's go ahead and dive in. So I'll start us off. Today, we're going to be focusing primarily around the impeachment, which just closed, and the events which, specifically more around the events which led up to it, and the charges that were covered during it. So, as I would imagine those who might listen to this podcast know, on January 6th, 2021, the United States Capitol building was invaded for the first time in over a century,
Yeah,
I
well
guess.
over a century. Yeah.
And all of that was a culmination, which finished on that 6th when then President Donald Trump spoke at a rally in Washington, D.C., a Stop the Steal rally hosted, I think, by Women for Trump, though there were a lot of organizers, including Donald Trump's campaign. This was held to protest the 2020 election loss and the results of the Electoral College, though, of course, they did not acknowledge the election loss and instead continued to assert what we have also discussed in previous podcasts, but roundly debunked conspiracies. The Electoral College vote was being certified by our National Congress that day, and the protest was organized in part, as we said, by Trump's reelection campaign. He stated things like, we will never give up.
We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
He called it that it was really a landslide election. President Trump, he repeated, as I said, his unsubstantiated or outright debunked claims of fraud in both the November election and the Georgia U.S. Senate runoff got rolled in there too. He railed against Republicans that he deemed insufficiently supportive of his efforts to overturn the election, of course positioning it as loyalty to the party and country, as fascists are wont to do, and stated that he promised to primary the hell out of the ones that don't fight. The president also continued to publicly pressure his vice president, Mike Pence, to reject the electoral votes in states that he lost.
And Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution and for the good of our country. And if you're not, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. I will tell you right now. I'm not hearing good stories.
And at his encouragement, thousands of protesters after his speech proceeded to walk to the Capitol, about 2 miles down Pennsylvania Avenue, where a joint session of Congress was beginning the Electoral College vote count to formalize Joe Biden's win. Many in the crowd at the Capitol breached police perimeters and stormed the building, occupying and vandalizing and looting it for several hours, assaulting Capitol police officers and reporters, and even erecting a gallows on the Capitol grounds, attempting to locate lawmakers to take hostages and harm them. Many protesters were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," blaming him for not rejecting the Electoral College votes, although he lacked the constitutional authority to do so. The rioters targeted House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her office, vandalizing and looting them, as well as the other offices of other members of Congress.
I didn't steal it. I bled on it because they were fucking macing me and I couldn't fucking see. And so I figured, well, I'm in her office. I got blood in her office. I'll put a quarter on her desk, even though she ain't fucking worth it. And I left her a note on her desk that says, "Nancy Big O is here, you bitch."
When the security was breached, Capitol Police evacuated the Senate and the House of Representatives chambers. Several buildings in the Capitol complex were also evacuated, and all of them were locked down. Rioters occupied and ransacked the empty Senate chamber, while federal law enforcement officers had to draw handguns to defend the evacuated House floor. Pipe bombs were actually found at the offices of both the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee. Molotov cocktails and I believe also weapons were discovered in a vehicle near the Capitol. Molotov cocktails for sure, weapons by my memory.
This assault on the Capitol was widely condemned by political leaders and organizations in the United States and internationally. Mitch McConnell, then the Senate Majority Leader, called the storming of the Capitol a failed insurrection and said that the Senate will not bow to lawlessness or intimidation. Several social media and technology companies suspended or banned Trump's Twitter accounts and Facebook accounts from their platforms, and many business organizations cut ties with him. A week after the riot, the House of Representatives impeached Trump for incitement of insurrection, making him the only U.S. president to have been impeached twice. Trump was subsequently acquitted for a second time, though with 7 members of his own party voting guilty. It was the most bipartisan impeachment trial vote in our history, with Republicans arguing that while Trump was indeed partly responsible for the riot on the 6th, that Congress lacked the jurisdiction to convict a former president. After voting to acquit the president on all charges, Mitch McConnell stated, There's no question, none,
that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. No question about it. The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president. But in this case, the question is moot because former President Trump is constitutionally not eligible for conviction. I believe the best constitutional reading shows that Article 2, Section 4 exhausts the set of persons who can legitimately be impeached, tried, or convicted. It's the president, it's the vice president, and civil office.
So, with that, albeit brief and very high-level summary of events aside,
Yeah.
we kind of have to ask ourselves, how did we get here, and where the hell do we go from here?
Jeez.
Should Trump have been voted guilty? Should he be brought up on criminal charges for inciting a riot? And we're going to do our best to answer these questions today. We're going to go through some of the basis of impeachment, constitutional definitions. So some of that's going to be a little bit dry, but our charming wit will make it as engaging as possible. We're going to go through some examples of impeachment throughout our history, and then we're going to close out by looking at actual criminal incitement, and if there are things there. We're going to try and stay as objective as possible, but neither of us is going to be an unbiased narrator through this.
Yeah, agreed. And while we might make light of things and make jokes, 5 people did die during this riot, and that's not including 2 police officers that took their lives afterwards.
Or the, I think, over 100 police officers that were injured.
Yeah, it was truly a disgusting event, and that's not a, I don't think that's a controversial opinion. It was terrible, and the loss of life was terrible. So any jokes that we might make, I want to make sure that it's clear that we're not making light of the fact that people lost their lives, and that's tragic.
No, it's gallows humor.
Yeah, ugh, if literal, I guess.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeesh.
God. Yeah, that
I
was
know.
not an intended pun.
Yeah, off to a great start.
Okay. Well, on that
All
note,
right.
I'm going to dive into some of the drier portion.
Let's hear it, buddy. Dry me out.
So, what is impeachment? Impeachment, and this is the Encyclopedia Britannica definition, but this is just the definition of the word impeachment. It is the process by which a legislative body or other legally constituted tribunal initiates charges against a public official for misconduct. Again, though, that's impeachment in general. As with lots and lots of things, when we start talking about big or legal topics, it's going to vary country to country and place to place. So, in the United States, impeachment is defined pretty particularly in the Constitution, though the actual mechanics are not that well defined. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5 of the United States Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall choose their Speaker and other officers and have the sole power of impeachment. So, pretty explicitly granted to the House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 3, Clauses 6 and 7 provide that the Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. When sitting for that purpose, there shall be an oath of affirmation. When the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside, and no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. Judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to remove from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. But the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law.
So if I'm understanding that, it's basically the idea that they can't throw anyone in jail from a Senate trial. They can only prevent them, remove them from office, prevent them from getting elected to or holding a future office.
A future impeachable office, in fact.
Impeachable office. Got it. And just because they're convicted in the Senate doesn't mean that they're not eligible to have criminal or civil suits brought against them.
Exactly. This is the constitutional basis that A, the Senate is where the trial will take place. B, the oath of affirmation is the oath of impartiality senators are supposed to take as jurors. that it's 2/3 of members present. So while we throw 67 votes out, that's if all 100 members are present for the vote.
Mm.
And it also is the constitutional basis that impeachment, and this is something we're going to emphasize a lot, is not a civil or criminal process. It is distinct. It is not a, other than the fact that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over a presidential impeachment, it's not a process that has much judicial bearing whatsoever. And it is even defined a little bit further. So Article 2, Section 2 states that, and it's referring to the president, shall have the power to grant reprieves, pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. So there is the specific and explicit constitutional basis that impeachment is not pardonable, which A, impeachment's not pardonable, and B, further constitutional basis for the distinction between criminal, civil, and impeachment processes. Article 2, Section 4 provides that the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. That is basically the extent of the constitutional definitions of impeachment. That is as much guidelines as the Constitution provides for what is impeachable, who is impeachable, and how the process should be constructed for each impeachment.
Yeah, that's the bribery section of this, as we'll talk about a little bit further down when we get into the history, that comes up a lot. Treason, not as much, but bribery, definitely.
There's a lot of time. Well, and that's because, bribery is basically the only criminal code thing there that is specifically called out. And treason, while we throw that word around a lot, and I think rightfully so for any kind of colloquial general speech definition of the term, treason is one of the few constitutionally defined crimes, and it's defined incredibly specifically as granting aid or comfort to an enemy of the United States, I think.
During a time of war, yeah.
That is off the top of the head. And yeah, an enemy is defined very specifically as a foreign power with which we are at a declared war.
Formally declared by Congress, yeah.
Treason, even if someone is someone we would in any good faith call a traitor, that often doesn't actually mean they committed the criminal offense of treason.
Very specific.
Which is perfect to transition into this next section because it gets to the fact that that's the constitutional language. But, and unfortunately in popular discussion, often language is equated. We've seen it over and over again. Sometimes it's used as political cover, as I would argue it was in this case, that we equate terms like treason is a great example. The way we, generally speaking, use the term traitor often just means seditious, but not treason. And a really, really good example of that is the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors. So that is the third category of impeachment. And based on historic definition, one would kind of expect it to be the most used kind, because high crimes and misdemeanors is actually a phrase from the 17th and 18th century English common law. Now, we could do an entire podcast about this, but common law is very different from the way law works in the United States, but common law forms the basis of a lot of constitutional law, which then works differently from a lot of the rest of our legal system, because, of course, our founders were primarily from Britain and basing a lot of what they were doing on how British law worked. In fact, when people now will talk about, high crimes and misdemeanors, but that's not a misdemeanor, well, the phrase misdemeanor and the way we use it now, even in the legal sense, didn't even exist when the Constitution was written. Well, the Constitution was written before we had a country, so there were no misdemeanors in criminal code at that time. In fact, high crimes and misdemeanors in 17th and 18th century English common law refers specifically to corrupt activity by those who have special duties that are not shared with common persons. That's a quote from a book by John Rowland, January 19th, 1999, and the meaning of high crimes and misdemeanors by the Constitution Society.
Oh, sounds like a thrilling read.
No, but reputable.
But reputable. That's what's important.
It did grow a bit more specific in the late 18th century, so it's the late 1700s, to mean the first and principal high misdemeanor was maladministration of such high offices as are in public trust and employment. That's based on the Commentaries of the Laws of England, which was published in 1765. So here we're getting again into how it's different from common parlance. The phrase misdemeanors does not mean the modern conception of the term misdemeanors. And the phrase high crimes does not even actually refer to very serious crimes. It doesn't necessarily refer to like levying treason. A high crime is a crime committed by a public official or involving the misuse of a position of authority. So high crimes and misdemeanors, we could summarize, at least for the purposes of our podcast, and largely it gets used this way in the text that I was looking at, as abuse of office, right? It's not necessarily a serious crime, it's just an abuse of office. Some of the historic examples of impeachment from English common law would include, like, they impeached people for hiring relatives into positions. So nepotism, things like that. It's just using your office to abuse the public trust.
Gotcha. I think that's really important to make that distinction, because when you, and I'm guilty of this too, when you hear the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors, that has a very specific, it evokes a very specific thought in our head based on our common parlance that we use. But it's good to know what the context is behind the meaning of the phrase, and I think you laid that out really well right there.
Well, thank you. And I absolutely think you're correct, because it dramatically changes what we might feel impeachment is for. It means impeachment isn't necessarily just for serious offenses. It's for administering your office badly.
It's for hiring your nephew, Frank, and then paying him a bunch of money to sit around and play Nintendo all day.
Yeah, like maybe like hiring your unqualified son-in-law and then trusting him with like way too much stuff after you like overrode the fact that he failed his background check and shouldn't have even been given a security clearance. That could be an example. Totally hypothetical.
Totally
obviously.
hypothetical.
That sounds to me like a high crime or a misdemeanor.
Yeah,
right?
It sounds like that's the kind of guy that we want to have bringing peace to the Middle East.
Yeah. Or handling maybe like a response to a pandemic.
Ah, totally.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Also, I'm going to take this point to emphasize again, because where we're talking about language, Article 1, Section 3, Clause 7 specifically designated that impeachment is separate from criminal or civil process. It is a specifically political process about the conduct of the subject of the impeachment. And, quote, congressional impeachments do not fit neatly and logically into categories. This is based on the work by J.P. Cole and T. Garvey, published in October 29th, 2015. Our link will be in the document.
There you go. Way to cite your sources.
Thanks. This is because impeachment is intended to, quote, reach a broad variety of conduct by officers that is both serious and incompatible with the duties of the office. That's from the same source. And I think this makes sense, given that what high crimes and misdemeanors mean, right? It's just the maladministration of your office. Impeachment cannot be limited to the criminal or civil code because it's intended for a very specific subset of people that could only do those things as a part of the administration of an office. It's why the punishment is removal and prevention from office. Because if they just weren't in office, they can't even do it anymore. It's why it's separate from criminal, because you don't need to solve that problem by throwing them in jail. You just remove them from office, and the problem can't happen.
It doesn't mean that you can't throw them in jail. It just means that for political purposes, that's not the purpose of impeachment.
Oh, absolutely. Someone could absolutely be impeached for something that was also a crime and could face criminal consequences. But it doesn't have to be a crime. It just needs to be something about using your office badly. Impeachment even has different standards of proof or evidence. Notably, as we read through the Constitution earlier, there aren't any. They're not predefined. Now, you'd still be held to standards of perjury because it's Senate and House hearings, right? And you can't just show up, well, historically speaking, the law kind of said that you weren't supposed to be able to just show up and lie in those, and you could potentially face perjury charges. I personally fall more in the side which many House managers have argued. I found, I don't have this source here because it's shown up in seemed like nearly every impeachment a House managers have presented, that given the nature of the charges and issues at stake, strict standards of evidence, like beyond a reasonable doubt, kind of run counter to the purpose. You're not trying to take someone's freedom away because it's not a criminal process. They don't stand to end up in jail. They stand just to not be able to hold office anymore. That's it.
Yep. Can no longer be elected dog catcher.
Yeah, because, well, that wouldn't fall into federal impeachment. I think they probably still could run for dog catcher.
Is there no federal dog catcher position? I thought
Not
maybe.
as far as I'm aware. And, well, we'll get into this in a second. That wouldn't fall into an impeachable office unless it was raised to a constitutionally defined cabinet level position.
All right.
Because, as we said too, as specifically defined in the Constitution, the only potential outcomes of impeachment are removal from office, removal from these positions of trust, and the prevention of holding them again. It is not a criminal process.
Got it.
So, we've got laid out so far what it is. And Michael, you touched on with dog catcher, probably an important thing. Like, who can we impeach, right? With some of the participation from senators and House members, I've seen a lot of comments and things like that with people throwing around, well, impeach them too. And the fact is you can't. Because specifically in the U.S., the impeachment process is by which the House of Representatives brings charges against the president, vice president, or something in the Constitution defined as an officer of the United States. And what is that? A federal officer is a tenured functionary of the executive or judicial branches of the federal government of the United States to whom is delegated some part of the country's sovereign power. This is defined both through the historical meaning of those words when the Constitution was written, and then also through ongoing precedent as that phrase has come up. So this includes federal judges, ambassadors. The president and vice president are named specifically and separately, so they don't fall under that. But it also includes cabinet members. That may or may not include things that we now in modern times define as cabinet level positions, and rather just the actual cabinet members as sometimes defined through other parts of the Constitution. But as with many things with constitutional law, you don't necessarily know for sure until you try and it goes to SCOTUS.
Right. So if there was a secretary of dog catching that was appointed by the president
and confirmed by the Senate,
and confirmed
that
by
would
the
likely be impeachable. Yes.
All right. Impeach that dog catcher. Anyway, I don't know why I'm being so hard on dog catchers. They're fine.
So there are still this is outside the realm of impeachment. There are some mechanisms by which those that don't fall into impeachment processes can be removed. Article 1, Section 5 states that each House may determine the rules of its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior, and with the concurrence of 2/3 expel a member. So the House of Representatives can expel members of the House of Representatives, and the Senate can expel members of the Senate. But the House can't really do anything to the Senate, and the Senate can't really do anything to the House. Again, this is not impeachment, and it does not involve the other House in the legislative branch. There actually notably is no recall mechanism for House of Representatives members or senators. And even when Arkansas attempted to put term limits on their federal officers, they actually amended their state constitution to add, I think, a 3-term limit. It's not really important. And that was ruled as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1995.
Interesting.
So you can't, that can only be changed at the federal level for mechanisms to remove members of the House of Representatives or the Senate. Well, again, it's constitutional law, at least of the means that have been tested thus far. But if amending a state constitution doesn't do it, it's probably pretty limited.
It's a higher bar for sure.
So that takes us into, if these are the people who can be impeached, maybe let's look at some examples.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a really fun time looking into a lot of these. I say fun because some cool stuff came up, and we'll talk about it. There's some good examples of how history repeats itself and how nothing has really changed that much since the 1800s. We're pretty much still the same country we always were, and we've always been. Well, you'll see. So, how many impeachments, trials, convictions have there been over the course of history of our country? Surprisingly, not that many. Of presidential impeachments, we've only ever had 3 United States presidents go through and be impeached by the House of Representatives. Andrew Johnson was the first one in 1868. Bill Clinton in 1998, over 100 years later. Donald Trump, very famously or infamously now, was impeached twice, once in 2019 and once in 2021. Richard Nixon, you might remember that he got in trouble for organizing and directing some pretty shady espionage stuff at a specific hotel, the one that which we now use the suffix for every sort of scandal in Washington. He resigned as a result of the Watergate scandal. I'm going to put the emphasis on the gate. In 1974, after the House Judiciary Committee passed articles of impeachment, but before the House could actually vote to impeach him. So he was like, nope, I'm out. Guys can't impeach me if I'm not in office. And honestly, constitutionally, that is a gray area that we'll talk about a little bit. Can you actually impeach somebody who is no longer in office? There turns out there is some precedent for that we'll talk about in a little bit when we talk about judges. So, as you mentioned before, judicial branch and agents of the judicial branch are subject to impeachment. They can be impeached
Indeed.
and removed. And so far in our country, 15 federal judges have been impeached by the United States representatives. 3 resigned after impeachment, 4 were acquitted after impeachment, and 8 were convicted and removed from office by the Senate.
More than half.
Yeah, a little more than half. It turns out that when you do something serious enough to warrant impeachment, generally there's decent evidence of that gets brought to the Senate.
Or at least there used to be.
There used to be. Yeah, we used to, as you'll see, we had some different standards for our office holders back in the day that it's a little disappointing that we don't still have those ideas now.
Higher.
Yeah.
Oh, excuse me.
Should be.
Although, yeah, I mean, it makes sense why so much of this is so cloudy when you look at the fact that that means there have only actually been 19 impeachments.
Yeah.
So the nature of it with high crimes and misdemeanors is that these situations are going to be very specific. They could vary a lot from situation to situation. So even if there were more, the precedent might not necessarily imply impeachment to impeachment. And there have only been 19.
Yeah.
So that's just not a lot.
It's not something we do very often in this country. Yeah.
It's not like when someone gets tried for drug possession and there have been tens of thousands, or I picked a bad reason.
Yeah.
Let's go with theft. It's not like when someone gets charged with theft and there's hundreds of thousands of cases to draw a precedent from.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, and as you say, criminal precedent doesn't apply in these situations. And there haven't been too many impeachments or really enough to set a lot of precedent, but there have been some, and we'll talk about those a little bit. And as you noted too, the bar is not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's really just, does the majority of the Senate, 2/3, agree that you've committed some sort of high crime and misdemeanor or bribery or treason.
Yes.
So I'll talk a little bit about this. I don't know if I'm going to talk about every single one of the convictions and removals, but there's some interesting ones. The first person to be impeached was Judge John Pickering of the U.S. District Court for the District of New Hampshire. He was impeached on March 2nd, 1803, on charges of mental instability and intoxication on the bench. He was convicted and removed from office on March 12th of 1804, a year later. I tried to look at that guy and see, like, this sounds like a fun story. What is going on with this dude? And honestly, I couldn't find too much. It seemed like he was in his 60s. He seemed like he would probably had some sort of early onset dementia or something like that. It seemed a little more sad than it was nefarious or
Oh,
entertaining. So,
bummer.
yeah. So we won't talk about that one as much. An interesting story. There've been a few more that are like Halstead L. Ritter, who was impeached in 1936. He was a district court judge for the Southern District of Florida on charges of favoritism and appointment of bankruptcy receivers and practicing law while sitting as a judge. So can't do that. Can't practice law and sit as a judge.
What would be the problem with that?
Yeah,
God.
yeah.
Cancel culture.
Cancel culture. Oh, there was another interesting one a little bit earlier. That was West H. Humphreys, U.S. District Court for the Middle Eastern and Western Districts of Tennessee. He was impeached on May 6th, 1862, important year, on charges of refusing to hold court and waging war against the U.S. government. He was obviously a judge in the District of Tennessee that seceded from the Union, and the rest of the United States Congress, House and Senate, didn't appreciate that very much. So,
Here, I thought this was a free country.
yeah,
Just because he left the country, he couldn't still be a judge?
yeah, he's waging war on the U.S. government. Sounds harsh. Anyway, he was convicted and removed from office in 1862. Didn't take him very long. That was almost a month. Still, though, actually, kind of a longer impeachment and trial process than we just went through. Interesting precedents there. Literally waged war against the U.S. government.
Of course, they were probably dealing with a few other things beyond just a judge of a section of the court that wasn't in the country anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, he was still in the same place. He just wasn't in the country anymore, according to him.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
yeah, there were a
and-
couple other things going on there. We'll talk about some of those things too. There's some Civil War history coming up that is both interesting and depressing, depending on how you look at it. That Alcee Hastings, U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Florida, was impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives on August 3rd, 1988, on charges of perjury and conspiring to solicit a bribe. He was convicted and removed from office in October 20th of 1989. He's notable because he was convicted, but he was not prevented from seeking office in the future. And so he is a current representative, U.S. representative for the 1st District of Florida, I believe. And yeah, he's currently serving in the House of Representatives, and he has been for a while.
Go Florida.
Yeah, go Florida. And when you look into this too, what he was accused of, and this was actually brought up in criminal court, where he was implicated in a bribery scandal, but he was not convicted. I don't even think was brought to trial. They didn't bring formal charges against him. But regardless of that, the House impeached him and the Senate convicted him. Although he was only ever tried by a Senate Judicial Committee, he wasn't tried by the full Senate. And he went back to the Supreme Court and said, I didn't get a fair trial. I was removed incorrectly by the Senate, because even though the Senate voted to remove him, and it was actually mostly democratically held Senate at the time, and he was a Democrat. I should note that he's a black Democrat. He did not get a full trial by the Senate, and so that he went to the Supreme Court and said that they infringed on his rights to that trial. So interesting. The Supreme
How
Court.
did the Supreme Court find?
They were also doing another case that was being brought before them of another judge who was removed, and basically the Supreme Court said, we don't get to weigh in on this. This is a
Interesting.
Yeah, they said this is outside the jurisdiction of the court.
So the trial took place in the Judiciary Committee. Did they do a floor vote to impeach?
They did. They did a floor vote to impeach, yes, but he did
Oh,
not get a
okay.
full trial in the Senate.
The thing is that the Constitution does not define what the sole power of trial resting with the Senate is. So I think if the session defines that as just the floor vote and finds the Judicial Committee's findings to be compelling enough, I'm not really surprised that the Supreme Court didn't overrule that.
Yeah, it's something for constitutional scholars to debate, but I think the most important point where there was the Supreme Court said, "Hey, this is something that is the sole discretion of the House and Senate. This is their function in the government, and we can't weigh in as to whether or not that process that they followed was constitutional or not."
Yeah. Well, I suspect that if the process were more defined in the Constitution and then they didn't follow the constitutionally defined process, then they could weigh in. But the process isn't defined. And that impeachment, the Senate decided that the trial was just a vote.
Yep, in that case. And the other case that was going on at the time that was basically they were deciding both cases at the same time is kind of how that functionally worked. But it was Walter L. Nixon. He was a U.S. District Court of the Southern District of Mississippi. He was impeached in 1989, so just around the same time, and convicted and removed from office in 1989. He was petitioning the Supreme Court for different reasons, but functionally the Supreme Court came back and said, hey, we can't weigh in on this. He was impeached because he used his connections with the state prosecutor to drop drug possession charges for the son of one of his business partners, and then lied about his involvement under oath to a grand jury. So the reason that's important is because that case was cited as precedents for impeaching Bill Clinton for perjuring himself.
Also in front of a jury.
Also in front of a jury. So because they impeached and convicted this guy, Bill Clinton had the precedent to be impeached and ultimately acquitted, but they were able to bring that charge because of that precedent. So as you can see, there's not been, as you noted, there hasn't been that many impeachments, so precedent is pretty slim, but still some of it is being used.
Yeah.
So some anecdotes, impeachment anecdotes. I'll go into a little bit more detail on this one because this one was interesting. William W. Belknap. Belknap? I'm not really sure how you say that. I should have looked that up. He was the Secretary of War under President Grant in 1869, which was just after the Civil War.
For curious listeners, the Secretary of War is basically the modern Secretary of Defense.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes.
Look at that. I've learned something
new. It's
new.
a much better name, right?
It is a very cool name.
Well, no, I mean, Secretary of Defense is a much more politically salient name than Secretary of War.
Secretary of War. We could just do like they did in South Park and designate Sheila Broflovsky as the Secretary of Offense under Bill Clinton's cabinet. Anyway. So,
I hope there doesn't come a day when we start citing South Park as judicial precedent.
Only when we decide to wage war on Canada for their smutty television shows. Anyway, all that notwithstanding.
I'd be comfortable with it in that limited situation,
Okay.
yes. But it'd have to be done in song.
Oh, yes. All of it performed as a musical. So, all right, Willie W. Belknap. I'm going to say Belknap.
Willie B.
The K is silent. So he was implicated in the 1876 Trader Post scandal at Fort Sill, which led to his
Grant
resignation.
had a ridiculously corrupt cabinet.
He really did. Boy. And this guy was no exception. Interesting enough, though, despite the fact that he had resigned and left office, he was impeached by the Democratic-controlled House and tried in the Senate. And while the majority of senators voted to convict him, they lacked the two-thirds required, and he was acquitted, although he was not in office anymore by the time he was impeached.
I would also like to note, though, that when we say Democratic-controlled, that would be pre-Southern strategy, and this would be at a time when the Democratic Party was the conservative party.
Yes, and in this next section, we'll make that point very clear. I will be talking about Democrats and Republicans, and it is important to note that in the 19th century, in the 1800s, the Democrats were very much the party of slavery, and the Republicans were very much the party of emancipation and equal rights. And then somewhere around the 1930s, 1960s, I think, there was a swap in kind of moral objectives and priorities between the two parties.
Yeah, it occurred over a relatively long period of time. I think Strom Thurmond was one of the last to switch
Yeah.
parties.
Yeah. At any rate, just a little bit about this scandal, this Trader Post scandal. It was a scheme in which Belknap, Willie Belknap, received kickback payments derived from a tradership contract for Fort Sill. So he basically lobbied Congress to be granted sole power to appoint licenses and ownership rights to highly lucrative tradership deals at U.S. military forts in the Western Territories. He further empowered these traderships by granting them virtual monopolies and helping them drive their competitors out of business. And then, after an investigation started by Congress resulted in him handing in his resignation to President Grant. But even though he was already out of office, the House of Representatives still saw fit to impeach him, and the Senate still tried him, although in absentia. So that's an important point to make now, because that's going to come back. Well, I guess we've already mentioned it before, that Mitch McConnell said that the Senate did not have the jurisdiction to try a president while he was no longer in office. And I think...
Though I would like to note that in this particular case, we're not even talking about the trial.
Right.
The actual House of Representatives impeachment vote took place after he was out of office.
Correct.
And that was not the case in 2021.
No. I would say this even sets even stronger precedents to that point.
There's an additional example as well. It was a judge, and the judge's trial took place after the judge had resigned, and Thomas Jefferson presided over the impeachment trial. I would note that as a founder and framer of the Constitution, he probably had a good idea of whether or not they thought impeachment trials should take place after the person was out of office.
You would think he'd have some thoughts on that. Yeah.
Maybe. And this is the real Thomas Jefferson, not the Thomas Jefferson so often quoted by right-wing fringe media figures.
Yeah. It is confusing, but those are definitely two separate people.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of someone who's also an asshole, okay, during my research and looking into impeachment, and of course, as I mentioned before, one of the first presidents to be impeached was Andrew Johnson. And reading into this guy, I was like, oh, holy shit, I can draw so many comparisons to a certain former president that we are currently talking about in a roundabout way, whose impeachment trial that we just got to watch. So I'm gonna walk you through a little bit about Andrew Johnson and see if you can't see some similarities between this guy and a certain President Donald Trump. So Andrew Johnson was our 17th president of the United States. He was president from 1865 to 1869. He was born poor in North Carolina, and despite never having attended school, this tailor's apprentice was elected mayor of Greenville, Tennessee, and subsequently elected to the North Carolina House of Representatives when he was only 27 years old.
I would say never having attended school in the 1800s, though, is different than being elected to Congress after not having graduated from high school in 2020.
Yeah, it might be a little bit different. The education standards were different back then. You know what? Honestly, I think I said Greenville, Tennessee. I think that's a mistake. I think that's probably supposed to be Greenville, North Carolina, because he didn't get out of North Carolina too much until, well, some other stuff happened, but he ran away from his apprenticeship. So, but yeah, you can look into that while I am reading the rest of this. So I want to get this right, because I'm going to talk shit about him, and I don't want to misrepresent his early years.
It was Greenville, Tennessee.
It was Greenville, Tennessee. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Look at that. He came back to North Carolina after that and was elected to the North Carolina House of Representatives for the state. He was 27 at the time. And then he became the governor of Tennessee, which is a little bit crazy. Crazy of a jump for a guy with no education, governor of Tennessee. Served there for a few years and then became a U.S. Senator in 1957 at the age of 49. And I should say by this point, he was already the slave owner. He got his first slaves when he was 35.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things I take issue with owning human beings, well up on that list. I don't know how much I take an issue with his education. I know that the Department of Education, for example, was founded much later.
Sure.
And I don't think we had a very robust or a public education system at that time. So I don't think that's just that big a deal.
Maybe we can give him a pass on that.
Yeah.
Giving him a pass on owning people, though, I think that automatically makes you an asshole.
Yeah, no passes there. Not even with historical context, because there were abolitionists when this country was formed.
100%. Funny story about that. So, after the ratification of the 14th Amendment, I think it was around that same time, and he freed his slaves, I think, a year in advance, and I think he had
For
10
listeners, the
slaves
14th
total.
Amendment is the amendment that abolished slavery except for people in prison.
Yes, and he was not a fan of the 14th Amendment, by the way. So we'll talk about that in a second. Yeah, and when he freed his slaves, they gave him a watch that basically was inscribed with an inscription that said that something about or his dedicated loyalty to the abolition of slavery or something like that. He's a confusing guy because
Interesting watch to give a man who is specifically not an abolitionist.
and who previously owned you. But hey, I'm not going to shit on them. It's a nice gift, whatever. But the point is that he's a confusing fellow.
Probably bought it for himself.
And just said it was from his slaves. Look how much they loved me. Honestly,
that is total speculation. Just to be clear, listeners, there was no research done. That is a completely baseless statement on my part.
You can't libel the dead, though, right?
Well, no, but I don't want someone to think that was factual
Okay.
or I looked it up anywhere.
Fair enough. I wouldn't be surprised, although that is conjecture.
Yep.
As I talk a little bit more about this guy, you'll realize why I'm not so surprised about that.
I'm not sure how his former slaves would have had the money to buy an inscribable watch.
I don't know. Yeah, exactly. So after the Southern states, the Confederate states, seceded from the Union, he was the only senator of a Confederate state that did not resign his seat upon learning of the state secession and stood firmly with the Union. So point to him for that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the end of the Civil War, he was chosen as Abraham Lincoln's vice president, which was a logical choice to send a message of unification to the newly defeated Southern states.
Yep.
And Lincoln called his coalition the Unity Party. I think a National Unity Party, I think is what it was called.
Yeah.
So, as we know, unfortunately for old Abe, something bad happened to him while he was in the theater, and Andrew Johnson assumed the office of the presidency after Lincoln was shot in the head by John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
hypothetical, counterfactual, but I would say probably also, unfortunately for the country, since Andrew Johnson completely fucked up Restoration.
Oh God.
And
Yeah.
is likely historically responsible for a lot of the problems we have in the modern day South because of that.
Very likely, and he's definitely up there with Donald Trump as the worst presidents of all time, and you'll see why here in a little bit. So Andrew Johnson favored quick restoration of the seceded states back into the Union without the protection for the former slaves that had just been recently freed.
Who would have ever expected that a man who opposed the 14th Amendment and was specifically not an abolitionist might oppose civil rights protections for former slaves?
Yeah, and treating them like they had equal rights to white people. Yeah.
How could we have predicted
No,
that?
totally out of the blue. So this put him at odds with the radical Republicans in Congress, which is just a fun name to say. Radical Republicans supported the immediate and complete eradication of slavery and equal protections for newly emancipated slaves. So they were pretty awesome back in the day. So Congress started passing many laws overriding Andrew Johnson's numerous vetoes. These laws included things like the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the District of Columbia voting bill, and the ratification of the statehood for Nebraska, to name just a few. So basically what would happen is Congress would pass a law, Andrew Johnson would slap his veto down on it, and then Congress would be like, no, fuck you, we're going to pass this anyway.
Yeah, they had the supermajority necessary to override veto.
Exactly.
He vetoed statehood for Nebraska?
Yes. What's wrong with Nebraska? I don't know.
It would have been a northern non-slave state and
Yeah.
changed the balance of power between conservatives and
Something
But I would, yeah.
might have had something to do with that. Yeah.
I certainly can't think of a modern equivalent where a political party might oppose statehood for a territory.
No. No, gosh, you wouldn't ever hear of that happening today. So Congress doesn't like Andrew Johnson very much. Andrew Johnson doesn't like Congress very much. And so Andrew Johnson's impeachment was initiated on February 24th, 1868, when the U.S. House of Representatives resolved to impeach him for high crimes and misdemeanors, like we talked about before, basically abuse of office,
Yep.
which were detailed in 11 articles. So the primary charge against Johnson was that he had violated the Tenure of Office Act, passed by Congress the year before, over Johnson's veto, of course. Specifically, he had removed from office Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, whom the act was largely designed to protect. Stanton often sided with the radical Republican faction in Congress that passed the act and other acts that were largely supportive of giving emancipated slaves equal protections and rights, and Stanton didn't have a very good relation with Johnson because of this. Stanton was an interesting guy. Apparently, he was also the guy that organized the manhunt for the conspirators that assassinated Lincoln. And also, a fun fact that I didn't put in here was that Johnson was also supposed to be assassinated, but his assassin famously got drunk instead of going out to find him. But John Wilkes Booth had actually gone to Johnson's home earlier in the day before he went to the theater and assassinated Lincoln to check and see if Johnson was at his house. So there's a pretty good argument that they were trying to find out where he was so that they could assassinate all of them at the same time. But the guy instead got drunk, and Johnson basically had the guy executed anyway, so yeah, it was a whole thing. So this guy Stanton, good guy. Johnson doesn't like him. Congress says you can't get rid of him, but Johnson says, forget that, I'm going to get rid of him anyway, and attempted to replace him while Congress was in recess. So, yeah, Congress isn't happy about that, and Johnson became the first American president to be impeached on March 2nd, 1868. And his trial in the Senate began 3 days later with Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase presiding. On May 16th, the Senate did not convict Johnson on one of the articles, with 35 to 19 votes in favor of conviction, falling one short of the necessary two-thirds majority. And you might notice that those numbers don't quite add up to 100, and they wouldn't have back then anyway because we didn't have as many states, but also 11 states were not allowed to be in Congress at the time because they had just seceded from the Union. And a lot of this argument was, when do we allow these guys back into Congress, and when can they have representation again? And reading about Reconstruction, I mean, it is a crazy time. I mean, they had basically military generals that would run the states in martial law. And Stanton himself, I think, kicked out the elected governor of Texas, basically just said, nope, you're not the governor anymore. I have the power, and it's martial law. And Congress was deciding basically, how are we going to
repatriate everything.
Repatriate everybody, yeah, exactly. And one of those things was the ratification of the 14th Amendment. They had to ratify the 14th Amendment to be let back in, which was the amendment that provided equal rights to slaves and outlawed slavery, with the exception, as you noted, people in prison. Which
I would also like to note, it just outlawed slavery. It did not make sure they had equal rights.
Thank you for that correction. Yeah, that's something we've been fighting for a long time. Even though there were civil rights acts that Johnson vetoed that were then passed over his veto. And we've had many more since then, and we arguably need some more. But that's a whole different topic for another podcast. So they didn't convict him on the first count. They had 11 counts that they brought against him, and they were short by one vote, basically, to convict him. And they had a 10-day recess before attempting to convict him on additional articles. But on May 26th, the Senate didn't convict the president on 2 articles, both by the same margin, 1 vote short of conviction, after which the trial was adjourned without considering the remaining 8 articles of impeachment. They basically just said, we're not going to be able to do this. We give up. So the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson had a couple important political implications for the balance of federal legislative and executive power. It maintained the principle that Congress should not remove the president from office simply because its members disagree with him over policy, style, and administration of the office. And another point that's important to point out here is that they got rid of the Tenure of Office Act. They repealed it a couple years later. And similar laws have come before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has shot all of them down as unconstitutional.
Yeah.
So it's very likely that this law that they passed that said, hey, you can't fire cabinet members without our approval wasn't constitutional in the first place. So Johnson's argument that he had every right to challenge Congress on this, I think he wasn't out of line on that.
Though I would also note, well, yeah, I mean, this is kind of our whole modern I serve at the pleasure of the president thing for cabinet officials, right?
Right.
That the president can, of course, fire them, even though Congress confirms them, the Senate specifically. However, I would note, because, again, the process of impeachment is not criminal and it is political, just because the law was unconstitutional does not necessarily mean that Congress would not have been able to successfully impeach the person over it, because it's not so much about, impeachment is not the process of if you violated the law, it's the process of did you abuse your power, even if you skirted very close to violating the law.
Yeah. And in this case, he was in violation of the law, but the law was most likely unconstitutional. So his argument that he had the authority, and one would even argue the responsibility to test the limits of congressional power, that's kind of part of our checks and balances system. And I would argue that even though the guy was a jerk, that's still an important thing to have to be able to maintain our checks and balance system in our government.
Yeah, no, I would even agree there. Congress should not have the power to tell the president that he must retain a cabinet official that's not executing the agenda that president was elected for. Now, if they're executing an agenda that Congress views as an abuse of power, Congress also still needs the authority to impeach, but the president does have authority over the executive branch.
Yeah, he does. Good points on that. I think maybe we didn't see as many similarities between Johnson and Trump in that description as maybe I would have liked, but here's a couple more that are somewhat related to that I think you'll see a lot more similarities for. So I'm going to go over these quick because they're a little out of scope, but boy, they're on the nose. During Reconstruction, the Republicans supported full rights for newly emancipated slaves, and Johnson, along with the Southern Democrats, vehemently opposed equal rights, and their efforts to compromise on these matters all failed, and a political war ensued.
Thus the vetoes and veto overrides.
Exactly. So Johnson called a convention of the National Unity Party. That was Lincoln's party that he put together. The Republicans had basically just said, yeah, we're not using that name anymore. Lincoln was a Republican, if you remember. We're not using that identifier anymore.
Yeah, it was more a coalition than a formal party.
Exactly. It was kind of a what could have been for Reconstruction. But Johnson decided to use that term to unite his supporters and to gain election to a full term in 1868. So it basically said, I'm going to just take the National Unity Party as my moniker, and I'm going to run with this now, even though there's really no...
And we can be unified in ensuring that former slaves don't have equal rights.
And that I get elected to another term.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the battleground was the election of 1866. The southern states were not allowed to vote in this, important to note, because they had not been admitted back into the Union yet. So Johnson campaigned vigorously, undertaking a public speaking tour known as the Swing Around the Circle. I don't know if they talked like that, but I'm going to pretend like they did. The trip included speeches in Chicago, St. Louis, Indianapolis, and Columbus, and they proved to be politically disastrous, with the president making controversial comparisons between himself and Christ and engaging in arguments with hecklers.
Similarities.
These exchanges were attacked as beneath the dignity of the presidency.
Similarities.
The Republicans won by a landslide, and as a result increased their 2/3 majority in Congress and made plans to control Reconstruction over the objections of Johnson. Johnson blamed the Democrats for only giving lukewarm support to the National Unity Movement.
Similarities. Although blaming his own party, not blaming the other.
No, definitely blaming his own party. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's the similarity.
That's definitely the similarity. On February 22nd, 1866, George Washington's birthday, Johnson gave an impromptu speech to supporters who had marched to the White House and called for an address in honor of the first president. In his hour-long speech, he instead referred to himself over 200 times. More damagingly, he spoke of, quote, men still opposed to the Union, to whom he could not extend the hand of friendship he gave to the South. When called upon by the crowd to say who they were, Johnson named Pennsylvania Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, and abolitionist Wendell Phillips, and accused them of plotting his assassination.
Similarities. Yes.
Republicans viewed the address as a declaration of war, while one Democrat ally estimated Johnson's speech cost the party 200,000 votes in the 1866 congressional midterm elections.
Similarities.
So a couple of them, right? Sounds like somebody you know. Oh, and I got one more.
Politically inflammatory speech, signaling out political enemies as enemies of the state.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
quite similar.
Quite similar. And one final one. On March 3rd, the president hosted and this was just right after he had lost the election. The president hosted a large public reception at the White House on his final full day in office. Newly elected President Ulysses S. Grant had made it known that he was unwilling to ride in the same carriage as Johnson, as was customary, and Johnson refused to go to the inauguration at all. Despite an effort by colleagues to promote a change of mind, he spent the morning of March 4th finishing last-minute business and then shortly after noon rode from the White House to the home of a friend. I was going to say to his...
Was it a golf course?
To his golf course in Florida. But no, they only had horses. He couldn't go that far, so he just had to go to a friend's house. So anyway, I thought you'd get a kick out of that. I was reading this and I was like, holy shit.
I did indeed. It's almost like when you look through history, ideologues don't change that much.
No. Yeah. And assholes still manage to get to be the president of the United States somehow. It happens. Yeah. As we saw. So I think we've talked a lot about impeachment. We've talked a lot about who can be impeached, what impeachment looks like, what the consequences of impeachment are. And in the context of talking about Donald Trump and the Capitol riot on the 6th of this year, I think, it's clear at this point that the Senate has decided that, Donald Trump has been acquitted on all charges. And even though there is a pretty large faction of the Republicans in Congress and the Senate specifically that think that he is responsible, morally responsible for what happened, that he is...
Including many who voted to acquit.
Mm-hmm. Including many that, specifically Mitch McConnell.
Like Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell.
Mm-hmm. Thank God for Minority Leader now. Ugh. Yeah, it's pretty gross. And I think him saying... go ahead.
Yeah. Just before we move on to the next section, so like you said, this is bringing us to the end of the political process of impeachment.
Yeah.
And fun historical anecdotes aside, kind of switching us back to the topic of what happened, we've got impeachment, right? Political, not criminal process.
Right.
No one, never at stake in this process was if someone would end up in jail. Never at stake in this process was a change in the precedent for how the crime of incitement would be prosecuted. There is no risk here, no matter what the outcome was, that there would be a change to the legal precedents of how we define the actual criminal code around impeachment and what could land your average citizen or not so average citizen in jail. In the context of the fact that we have this wide phrase of high crimes and misdemeanors, and in the context of the fact that we have a president who spent, well, as we saw in the impeachment trial itself, years showing through his own comments that he found violence to be acceptable, and then months after the election, including on the 6th, including quite recently in an interview on Fox News, continuing to declare that he really had won the election in a landslide. And Michael, I kind of like to phrase it this way, but we have a man who, in his capacity as the office of president, when looking at people, we have a phrase to cover this. We hear it somewhat regularly. I more so from conservative media, but you've got the soapbox, the ballot box, the jury box, and the ammo box to solve our problems. That's purportedly what the Second Amendment is for, though not necessarily escalating to that point. And we have a president who told people that no one was listening, no one was paying attention, and they needed to make their voices heard, and that they were being silenced. That's that soapbox taken away. Not to mention encouraging protest in a time when the legal process was, like, the legal constitutional process of certifying the election was ongoing. The election is over. There is no more rallying votes when the election is over. So the soapbox is gone. You've got the ballot box. Well, the whole thing was about the fact that the election was stolen. So there is no ballot box to resolve that when you have the President of the United States claiming that his election was stolen from him, claiming that despite the fact that he lost by 7-odd million votes, that somehow he won in a landslide. That's your ballot box gone. Then you've got the jury box, where we're supposed to trust the legal system to resolve problems. And the President of the United States claimed that the Department of Justice, the Attorney General of the United States, his own Attorney General, and the FBI of the United States could possibly be involved. He claimed that Republican, people of his own party, state officials, were involved in this supposed steal. So there was no judicial process that could be trusted beyond this firm, unconstitutional claim that the vice president could somehow throw out the results of an election that was known to have been free and fair. So that's the jury box, the legal process taken. That leaves but one box. This is in the face of ongoing, publicly known reporting that there was a risk of violence, that these folks were agitated, and that he invited them there anyway. I am not a senator. I probably won't ever be one. I was not given the right to vote. But to me, from the political standpoint, we have the President of the United States using his office to escalate tensions, bringing people to the Capitol, and his own actions directly resulting in the events of the 6th. Now, for me, humble Carl, well, not very humble, but a person who has, no say in anything, this to me clearly constitutes a high crime and misdemeanor in the terms of the maladministration of the office. This constitutes something that the punishment of removal from office and prevention of being in office again solves the problem for the United States, because it removes his ability to be in a position of influence. And to me, a conviction on impeachment would have been fully appropriate in this case. And frankly, not that much of a punishment for Donald Trump. It just would be that he couldn't be president or one of these other impeachable offices again, to make sure that he doesn't have that influence anymore.
And let's not forget the fact that 5 people lost their lives needlessly because of the rhetoric, and directly in response to his actions. I would argue directly in response to his actions and rhetoric.
Well, and let's not sit here and act like any riot. No, riots are bad. Riots are bad.
Right.
This particular riot was an insurrection held in the name of the president, and that president was Donald Trump. It was not a protest for civil rights that turned into a riot.
No.
It was a campaign rally after the election was 3 months over.
Right.
That turned into a riot, and that riot was a seditious insurrection. And I know I said we'd try to be impartial. I am not impartial in this.
No.
I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that he was not acquitted, but I will also note this whole guilty until proven innocent thing doesn't mean we can't talk about it, and it doesn't even apply here because it wasn't a criminal trial.
Right.
So, I was getting a little wound up,
Yeah.
a little passionate,
No,
I apologize for cutting you off and then just going off,
No
Michael.
apologies necessary. I think it's really important to drive the point back home that this didn't need to happen. This didn't need to happen, and there needed to be consequences for it, and there's not. He is not.
And the problem, too, is he's now evaded political responsibility.
Right.
He has evaded the only tool that our political establishment has to apply political consequences. He has evaded.
Right.
And so we can also look at, are there other consequences he could face? And I mean, the obvious thought, and one we might see bandied about in some news media, are the consequences of criminal incitement.
Right.
But as we've noted, politics, impeachment, not a criminal process. Criminal incitement, obviously a criminal process.
Very
and
much.
so it's pretty different. There's different rules, which we will get to talking about. And there's a very different history, which I think you were planning to run us through a little bit so we could see kind of how it compares to some of this history we just talked about with impeachment.
Yeah. Yeah. And forgive me in advance. I'm going to go a little bit into, because when you start looking at criminal law and how it's been applied and how it's been applied in the past, there's a lot of complexity to it. And full disclosure for anybody that had any ideas that or misconceptions that we are not lawyers. I am not a lawyer. None of this is legal advice. This is just what average guy Michael is able to find by reading through, in this case, Title 18 of the United States Code, and other reputable law blogs, and all these things. And I should say that all of the sources that we use and everything that we're talking about today is all sourced in a document that we will have posted in the description of this video. But when we talk about criminal incitement, I think it's really important to note that we have a very important part of our Constitution, the First Amendment, that guarantees and guards citizens' rights to free speech, to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government. But these rights do come with limits. So certain speech or acts receive limited or no First Amendment protections, such as obscenity, child pornography, threats of violence, and speech that incites riots, violence, or insurrection. So specifically in this podcast, we're focusing on the latter, the speech that focuses and incites riots, insurrections. So criminal incitement refers to conduct, words, or other means that urge or naturally lead others to riot, violence, or insurrection. Many states and the federal government have enacted laws prohibiting inciting riots, violence, or insurrection, as you might imagine.
Yes.
Whether by those names or under laws prohibiting disorderly conduct, public disorder, mobs, breach of peace, etc. But how does the First Amendment apply in these situations? How does the law determine when speech crosses the line from protected advocacy to incitement of violence? So there's a little thing called the Brandenburg test, also called the imminent lawless action test. And that test remains a standard that's used in evaluating attempts by the government to punish inflammatory speech, and it's not been seriously challenged since it was laid down in 1969.
I would also note that by virtue of the fact that it's been around for that long, and unchallenged makes it even more established precedent.
Exactly. In very few cases have actually reached the court during the past decades that would test the outer limits of Brandenburg. And when I say court, I mean the Supreme Court. So Supreme Court decisions stress that democracy can't stand if speech or conduct disagreeing with the government is criminalized. I think that's not a controversial thing. That's a value that we all have as Americans. We're all allowed to say that our government is shit and not be punished by the government for it.
Yep.
So even when that speech advocates unpopular beliefs, condones racism, or suggests use of force, that's still protected speech.
Yes, you have a right to say it without punishment from the government.
Exactly. That is not the same thing as a social media company kicking you off their platform for saying racist shit.
Nope.
Not the same. Not protected
You do
speech.
not have a right to use someone else's megaphone to scream your bullshit.
Absolutely right. I like that analogy. That's good.
Thanks.
So the Brandenburg test has three major components: the intent to speak, the imminence of lawlessness, and the likelihood of lawlessness. And the imminence of lawlessness, I think, is a really important one that we'll have a little bit of discussion around, because that's a very key one. The Brandenburg test comes from a seminal case involving a Ku Klux Klan leader, and in that case, the U.S. Supreme Court found that the KKK leaders' anti-black, anti-Semitic, and anti-government comments were protected speech, even though those comments that suggested taking future revenge on the federal government.
If I'm remembering correctly and looking way back, but this was not a case where his speech led to some kind of riot. This was just a speech he gave
Correct.
to his fellow KKK dudes.
Yeah, I think he was actually speaking to a journalist at the time, but
Okay.
yeah, that was his audience. You know, taking revenge on the federal government, saying a bunch of racist, anti-Semitic bullshit. Supreme Court said that that's protected speech. So to cross the legal threshold from protected speech to unprotected speech, the Supreme Court held that the speaker must intend to incite or produce imminent lawless action, and the speaker's words or conduct must be likely to produce such actions. So these requirements are known as the Brandenburg test. So some racist dude saying, we gotta go take down Congress, we gotta go burn down the Capitol building, and he's saying it all the way over in fucking Texas or Arkansas. It's going to be a long time before he can get all those people from where he's standing all the way to Washington, D.C. So the imminence is not there. And the likelihood that people are going to listen to this guy and rally around his cause to go and burn down the Capitol building, not there. So you fail 2 of the 3 tests.
Frankly, even if his speech led to that happening over some long term, that would be much more likely to be sedition than incitement.
Correct. So, as we say on that one, so first, incitement requires violence. The incitement to violence requires proof that the defendant intended to incite violence or riot, whether or not it actually occurs. So you need proof of intent, which is tough.
Though, when intent comes into play in U.S. criminal code, it's also much, much, much harder to prove intent when the thing didn't occur.
Correct.
A similar example might be conspiracy to commit murder is way harder to prove if nobody gets murdered.
Right.
Just as incitement is going to be much, 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 much harder to prove intent if violence did not occur.
Right. Not impossible, just very difficult.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And careless conduct or emotionally charged rhetoric does not meet this standard. So I think that's another important point to know. Second, the defendant must create a sort of roadmap for immediate harm. Using general or vague references to some future act doesn't qualify as imminent lawless action. And finally, the defendant's words must be likely to persuade, provoke, or urge a crowd to violence. So I think as I'm saying these things, and anybody who's listened to Donald Trump's speech, we can tie that in more formally later. As I'm reading through these and as I was researching this, it does seem like his speech does fail on some of these categories. While I think, the moral thing is there, the more I'm reading about the criminal incitement, and maybe we'll find some things that will lead us to believe otherwise, but that's how it appears at this point. So one of the important tests of the Brandenburg test, it was kind of an important challenge, was Hess versus Indiana. And that's an interesting one to note. So this is also, profanity or offensive messaging alone isn't enough. The messaging must appeal to actions that lead to imminent violence. So an example of that is Hess versus Indiana. The case involves an anti-Vietnam War protest on the campus of Indiana University, Bloomington. Between 100 and 150 protesters were on the streets, and the sheriff and his deputies proceeded to clear the streets of protesters. And as the sheriff was passing by, a man named Gregory Hess, one of the members of the crowd, said to the sheriff, we'll take the fucking street later, or we'll take the fucking street again. It's not clear exactly what he said, but Hess was convicted in Indiana State Court of disorderly conduct because of that statement. And this went all the way up to the Supreme Court that reversed his conviction because Hess's statement, at worst, amounted to nothing more than advocacy of illegal action at some indefinite future time, unquote. In contrast to such an indefinite future time, the court emphasized the word imminent in being imminent lawless action, test of Brandenburg, because the evidence didn't show that Hess's speech was intended and likely to produce imminent disorder. The state could not punish his speech.
Important.
Yes, important. And in addition, Hess's speech was not directed at any particular person or group, and as a result, it cannot be said that he was advocating, in the normal sense, any action. For similar reasons, Hess's speech could not be considered fighting words under Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire, which is a whole other frickin' thing that I won't even go into right now. But fighting words are a thing. If you want to find out what they are, look them up. It's all about Jehovah's Witnesses and flagpoles and nonsense.
That's Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire. For those interested, CHAPLINSKY versus New Hampshire. And you're going to have to figure out how to spell New Hampshire on your own.
Yeah, I believe in you. Okay, so we've talked about incitement to riot. We've talked about the Brandenburg test. So let's talk about some federal crimes that are centered around incitement. So there are specific federal statutes that punish acts relating to inciting riots, violence, crimes, or insurrections. Most specifically, the Federal Anti-Riot Act. In response to times of civil unrest in the 1960s, Congress enacted the Federal Anti-Riot Act. This law makes it a 5-year felony to travel between states or use a type of interstate commerce such as mail, phone, wireless communication, or broadcast, intending to...
I would like to note, too, that this was passed as part of the United States government long history of passing laws because of left-wing protests.
Yeah. When you see all these laws being passed in the 1960s, there's some
civil rights.
There's some important stuff going on in the late 60s, and we see these laws as a direct result out of that. And I'll talk a little bit about that too, but yeah, you see where that's going. So, 5-year felony to travel between states or use any type of interstate commerce, mail, phone, wireless communication, or broadcast that intends to incite a riot, participate in or carry on a riot, or commit an act of violence or furtherance of a riot. So a riot in this case means a public disturbance involving 3 or more persons whose actions or threats represent an immediate danger to person or property. So that's in the definition of Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 2101, 2102, updated in 2020. So very recent. The other code is inciting insurrection or rebellion against the United States government. That's a fun one. Federal law prohibits inciting, assisting, or engaging in any rebellion or insurrection against the authority, laws, or operations of the U.S. government. So, to convict, the prosecutor must show the defendant knowingly committed an overt act to further insurrection. A conviction carries up to 10 years in federal prison. So, in this case, insurrection or rebellion involves inciting, assisting, or engaging in acts of open resistance against the authority, laws, and operations of the government. That's a lot to take in, but that's a couple things. There's a couple people that are being charged with that as a result of the Capitol riots on the 6th.
Yes.
And
though to note, because we are still talking specific legal verbiage, all of these places where incitement is, or incite is in this code, is where our previous discussion about things like the Brandenburg test come in.
Exactly. That's the threshold to reach incitement. So you have to meet those standards in order to get to that point. And in some cases, there's some pretty compelling arguments that some of the actions of these people, and then others, as we'll see, reach that threshold.
Yeah. And, you know, it's this threshold is what we're getting ready to dive into, and it's pretty important. Because as we talked about with impeachment, the only possible consequences are removal from office and prevention of being in office. Being president is not a constitutional right.
Right.
It's just not.
It's not.
And so while the individuals and the impact to the nation is potentially higher because, you know, it's the president or federal judges or people that have a big impact on all of our lives, the evidentiary bar is a lot lower because the punishment is not as big a deal for the individual as the potential consequences of criminal conviction. A criminal conviction results in the literal stripping of constitutionally guaranteed rights. You lose your freedom of movement, your freedom of association, your freedom of speech is restricted. You can lose your right to own a weapon in some cases.
Yeah.
So I think it's important for us to remember in our desire for people to be held accountable about the potential consequences to all of us if these bars were to be lowered.
Mm-hmm.
And we should also take that into account when we think of certain rhetoric that's been used to defend not voting to convict for impeachment of the current president, as they, or former president,
Yeah.
rather.
Thank God for former.
As they voted the way they did while still acknowledging that he was responsible for the events.
Right. Yeah, totally agreed. So I talked about these sections a little bit, but I think I'm going to go over in just a tiny bit more detail and reiterate and kind of give an example about how this is currently being used, because the United States Department of Justice has been going after protesters of the George Floyd protests and other civil unrest that was going on last year. They've been using a lot of these same I know, believe it or not.
Now, Michael, that can't be right because Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity assured me that no one faced consequences for the protests that became riots over the summer, and they're only going after conservatives from the 6th because they're conservatives.
Yeah, yeah. Tucker and Sean might want to check their sources on that because that's it's not true. That's emphatically not true. Yeah, Trump specifically instructed his Department of Justice to go after people, specifically using these statutes. So, again, this is under Title 18 U.S. Code sections 200. Well, what am I going to call this? 2101 and 231. Let's call them that. So, again, 2101 is a law that bans using the facilities of interstate commerce or traveling across state lines to organize or incite a riot. And prosecutors have used Section 2101 to pursue protesters for allegedly inciting riots via social media, which is an established facility of interstate commerce. So, riots going on in other parts of the country, you are using inflammatory language, you are trying to rile people up, trying to incite violence through social media, you could find yourself, unfortunately, well, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, being charged under one of those statutes. And
I don't know. I mean, modern world, modern problems.
Modern world, modern problems.
Violence bad.
Violence bad.
Don't tell people to be violent when they're already protesting and tensions are high.
Yeah. The world's violent enough. We could do with less of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then Section 231 prohibits impeding or attempting to impede law enforcement officers performing official duties during a civil disorder, quote unquote, that disturbs interstate commerce or the performance of any, quote, federally protected function, unquote. The statute's broad parameters have enabled prosecutors to pursue protesters for a variety of minor crimes, often with an element of property damage. So, most specifically, the damage to the federal courthouse in Portland, Oregon. Protesters.
And by damage to the federal courthouse, you largely mean spray painting the temporary barrier around the federal courthouse?
I mean, won't whitewash it. They did break in one night and smash a bunch of shit and break windows and light shit on fire.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
the people who did that should face the consequences for their actions.
Agreed. Let's not do that. That's not good. But the people who are getting charged for shaking the fence, that was there illegally, by the way. They were violating municipal code by having a fence there, so they were getting fined daily for obstructing traffic. But the federal government, so they don't give a shit. Yeah. Anyway, we could do a whole podcast on that whole nonsense. And I should plug this too. There's a really, really great podcast series by Robert Evans of Behind the Bastards that goes into great detail about the civil unrest in Portland. I think he's got like 9 episodes, each an hour long, that document it from the beginning all the way to the end. And he was there on the ground and even got his finger broken during some of the clashes between right-wing protesters. Anyway, it's great. You should go listen to it. Plug over, but maybe we'll do something on that later. So the ability of Congress to criminalize these activities that we're talking about derives from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, known as the Commerce Clause, which endows Congress with the power to regulate commerce among the several states, and now the several 50 states now.
Yeah, it's like that particular clause is the source of a tremendous amount of the federal government's
Exactly.
governing ability.
So I'll go into just a little bit more on this. Section 2101, it's probably the most controversial statute to be used this way, in the way it's being employed by the Justice Department, as its legal framework has garnered criticism for First Amendment right implications since it was passed. It was passed as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. There we are again. And it's often referred to as the H. Rap Brown Act, after one of the leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a prominent civil rights group that encouraged civil disobedience in the form of protest. Brown was charged by Maryland authorities with inciting a riot in Cambridge, Maryland in 1967, spurring conservatives in Congress to insist on an equivalent federal statute in the upcoming civil rights legislation. So the statute has a divisive history, as it was the basis for prosecution against the Chicago Seven, a group of protesters accused of inciting riots during the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Good movie on that, I think. I think the movie's good. They came out recently about the Chicago Seven.
I have it in my list. I have not watched it yet.
Supposed to be good. Sacha Baron Cohen, I think, is in it. It was a really crazy event. It's worth looking into, but not worth diving into now. So the Justice Department has almost never used the statute since the Chicago 7 trial, invoking it only 4 times since 1970 and 2018. But recently, under our former president Donald Trump, the department has become to embrace it again. Prosecutors reportedly charged white supremacist protesters, positive, with 2101 in the past 2 years. And now federal prosecutors have used it repeatedly to pursue defendants who were protesting the death of George Floyd in 2020. So double-edged sword there on that one.
I don't even know if we call it that. If those prosecutions are constrained to the people who did encourage and cause violence, then
yeah, I guess really not double-edged sword in that way. It's working in the way it's supposed to be. Yeah, if you're inciting a riot or inciting violence, then good. You should be punished for that. I don't think that's
now that's us just talking without knowing any specific cases, which there could very well be some we disagree with vehemently.
Certainly. I don't know all the specifics. Yeah, like you said. There's probably some I don't agree with, and but I couldn't go that deep into the research on this because we're already at an hour and 45 minutes of content here.
Yeah. And now begins our 8-hour podcast talking about the entire last year.
Yeah. This is what happens when we take a break for like a month and a half. Just all this craziness. So primarily because Section 2101 prohibits a class of speech without tying that speech to imminent action, there's an argument there that it fails the Brandenburg test, and it's long been criticized as unconstitutionally infringing defendants' First Amendment rights. I don't know that it's been brought up to the Supreme Court yet. I don't think that it has, but I think with the events of last year and the events of the Capitol riots that we're seeing now, it's very likely that we're going to be seeing this brought before the Supreme Court.
Especially if they're using it to charge people who literally were not there and were acting on social media.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that would be a stretch. So, recently, in regards to that statute, a federal judge agreed that arguments in 2019, basically the argument that it infringed on the defendant's First Amendment rights, and dismissed 2101 charges against 3 members of the Rise Above movement, a white supremacist group that had violently disrupted gatherings and protests in California. But also a federal judge in Virginia refused to dismiss the incitement against 3 other Rise Above movement members, whom federal prosecutors accused of violating Section 2101 during violent confrontations in Charlottesville, Virginia, in 2017. So there's a bit of a discrepancy here. It's being upheld by some federal judges and it's being dismissed by others. So
That makes it more likely to go to SCOTUS.
yeah, I think it's very likely we'll see that coming up here, at least maybe in the next year. Who knows? So that's my very, very, very long explanation of incitement, and hopefully that's organized enough that that makes sense. Like I said, kind of as we were getting into this, this is case law. This is federal U.S. code. There's a lot to read in this, and for
Yeah.
somebody who is not a lawyer and didn't go to law school, some of it's hard to be able to conceptualize and condense down into something that's really accessible for people to understand and for laymen like me. So hopefully that was okay. If you followed it,
Well, I am a biased narrator for sure, but I think you did a good job. And I do want to take a look at two people who spoke on the 6th in particular.
Yeah,
We're going
let's
to
get
take a
back
look
to
at
that.
someone else next. So I'm taking us a little out of order. Sorry. But given the flow, I first kind of want to look at Donald Trump himself and his conduct on the 6th. Now, I have made incredibly plain my feelings about whether or not he deserved impeachment and the political punishments thereof.
he did.
That's, yeah, maybe. I mean, but we also wanted to take a look at, did Donald Trump rise to the level of criminal incitement? And it's easy to be frustrated and see this man dodge consequences for years and years and years, and see him dodge what again we argue are very appropriate political consequences, and thus want him to see criminal consequences. But we have to remember that while political consequences have a lower bar because the number of people that can be affected directly by them are much smaller, criminal consequences affect all of us. And when we think about whether or not what Donald Trump did rose to the level of criminal incitement, we have to look to the Brandenburg test. And it is a fact that he said march peacefully. It is a fact that he used the term fight, but used it, and a lot. I mean, a lot. Like, don't get me wrong, his language was inflammatory. But when he used the term fight at a political rally, in a political context, that is not a necessarily violent term when it comes to crime. It's a term that gets used very regularly and not prosecuted for incitement. Now, you might say, but Carl, this context is completely different. I'd be like, yes. But we have the Brandenburg test. I'm going to take it out of order, but I'm still going to go through the things. Was there a likelihood of lawlessness?
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is speculation by two not lawyers about something that we literally couldn't know unless it went to court and was decided. So it is a hypothetical stacked on a hypothetical by a person who didn't go to law school. But I think it's possible that they could prove that Donald Trump was aware there was a likelihood of violence. We saw media reports that covered the fact that there was a likelihood of violence. There is established fact that Donald Trump hangs on every word the media says. And I mean, maybe they could even produce a briefing where they told him that there was the likelihood of violence, or lawlessness, rather. The eminence of lawlessness, though, and the intent to speak and the intent to cause violence are very, very difficult. And with what we know, despite his conduct showing that he very clearly welcomed it, despite his conduct showing that politically he was very open to it, without some unknown witness or document coming forward that showed that he clearly was acting in concert with the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys, or someone coming forward that said he specifically had a conversation about how his language could be inflammatory and prompt violence, the language in the speech itself really probably does not rise to the level of criminal incitement. He is a man known well for using weaselly words. We talk about weaselly words to avoid criminal consequences in popular parlance all the time. People, they're just getting out of it. But that's a good thing for all of us, because we are talking about something that allows the government to take your constitutional rights away, and we do not want the government to be able to prosecute everyone who speaks at a rally that precedes a protest that becomes a riot just because they used language that wasn't completely clinical and explicitly nonviolent. We do want that level to be explicitly causing violence. And while Donald Trump's speech was filled with lies, while Donald Trump's speech rose the temperature in the room, while he egged his supporters on in a completely inappropriate way from the president, he did not specifically tell them to riot, so that is not an imminence of lawlessness. He specifically told them to march peacefully. That bar of proving that he intended for the riot to occur is almost impossible to cross over based just on his speech, based just on the testimony we've heard so far. And again, unless there is some hypothetical other witness, to me personally, I don't know that this crosses the level of criminal incitement. And I think I'm glad that it doesn't, because I don't want to see every protest organizer thrown in jail when some assholes start a riot at the end of their protest. Now, whether those assholes are police gassing everybody for being out after curfew, or whether those assholes are assholes throwing bricks, or whether those assholes are assholes storming the Capitol, I don't think we want our government to be able to take the freedoms away from civil organizers just because they spoke when they weren't explicitly violent. And I don't think putting Donald Trump in prison would be worth that cost.
That's really well said, man. I couldn't agree with you more. As much as I dislike Donald Trump, and as much as I find the language and the lies and all of it just completely unbecoming of a president and abhorrent, it's not worth the effect that it would have on the modern day general public.
Though it is exactly why impeachment would have been appropriate.
100%. 100%.
Now, there's some civil cases ongoing right now, and that's I mean, we're not legal scholars at all, and it is pushing the limits of what I can do to compare political impeachment with criminal law. I am in no way, shape, or form prepared to talk about civil liability.
Yeah, me neither. That's a whole other can of worms.
You know, maybe he becomes financially liable because of knowledge. There's way lower bars than criminal court for civil, but higher than impeachment bars. Well, they exist and are established, so obviously they're going to be higher than impeachment. But yeah, I mean, it just sucks because it probably means that because of the Republican Senate, Donald Trump seems like may well have skirted all official accountability. And it means that the only way we have left to really hold him accountable is make sure everyone remembers what he fucking did, so that if he tries to run again, nobody votes for him.
Yeah. That I hope that he loses in a landslide this time, and not just by 5 million votes.
7.
7. It needed to be more than that.
It should have been.
Yeah.
Well, and especially post the 6th, when the obvious consequences of his conduct occurred.
Right.
But yeah, so I mean, it's rough. It's annoying. It's angering. It's infuriating. It makes me even more angry at the senators who voted to acquit, but said he was responsible and claimed it was for the courts to levy consequences.
Yeah.
When obviously, if the two of us schlubs could figure out that, like, there's probably not criminal consequences, and we probably don't want there to be.
Right.
That, like, no, they abdicated it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Rah! But again, probably not criminal incitement.
No, probably not.
And again, we probably don't want it to be.
Yeah.
But I said there was another person we'd talk about.
Who's that, Carl?
That's Congressman Mo Brooks out of Alabama, Michael.
Now, I'm Congressman Mo Brooks from Alabama's 5th Congressional District, and I've got a message that I need you to take to your heart and take back home, and along the way, stop at the Capitol.
Oh, Mo.
And when we're talking about criminal incitement, Mo Brooks had some interesting things to say on the 6th that I think, as a layman, come a lot closer to the old Brandenburg test.
Oh, yeah? Like what, Carl?
Yeah, I've got some excerpts from his speech here, but I think the important excerpts from that speech are contextualized by really just one thing that he said that contextualizes it all, and I think speaks most thoroughly to the Brandenburg test. Mo Brooks stated that one of the things that made our country great, beyond his obvious fascist rhetoric where he talked about the military and strength and weird nationalism stuff, was that our ancestors had sacrificed
their blood, their sweat, their tears, their fortunes, and sometimes their lives
for all of those things and for this country. And repeatedly asked the crowd if they were ready to do the same.
Are you willing to do the same? Louder! Are you willing to do what it takes to fight for America? Louder! Will you fight for America?
Now, having just heard that, I think, and again, layman, talking to a layman, but to me, that approaches that Brandenburg test. Oof. Asking people if they are ready to sacrifice their lives is not to me a call for anything other than violence. That is not to me a call for peaceful protest. And when you add that to some of these experts that I'm going to read, which were clearly all raising the temperature of the room and vilifying people outright, well, Mo Brooks just ain't that good a guy, honestly. As an example, he started with, "Today is a time of choosing, and tomorrow is a time of fighting. Today is also a day of revelation and separation. Today, the curtain will be pulled back, and American patriots will learn by their votes which Republican senators and congressmen have the courage to fight for our America. Today,
by their votes, Americans will learn which Republican congressmen and senators love their bourbon, love their cigars, love their prestige, love their personal power, love their special interest group money more than they love America."
Now, I would like to be clear that Mo Brooks here, the ones that supposedly love America, would be the ones that voted to not accept the results of a secure democratic election. So that's vilification of a crowd that then later chanted to hang the vice president of the administration they were trying to secure power for. Mo Brooks went on to state that because today
Republican senators and congressmen have a simple choice. Today, Republican senators and congressmen will either vote to turn America into a godless, amoral, dictatorial, oppressed, and socialist nation on the decline, or they will join us and they will fight and vote against voter fraud and election theft and vote for keeping America great.
That is Mo Brooks telling these people that the people who vote to support the election are voting for a dictator. That is Mo Brooks telling the people at this rally that those who vote to support the election are stealing their country from them. A country he had just recently said that the best thing about it was that our ancestors died for it. Mo Brooks says that socialist Democrats attack our Bill of Rights on a daily basis. They attack freedoms of speech, freedom of association. They attack freedom of all kind, including the right to bear arms. Now let's be clear about these socialist Democrats. They also want to destroy our free enterprise system. They don't trust you with your individual liberty and freedom to do what's best for yourselves and your families. Now again, Mo Brooks has said that you can't trust the election. Mo Brooks has said that you can't trust the people in charge to do the election. That's the ballot box and the jury box. Now they're not a jury, but again, the jury box is the legal process. And now he's telling them that they're silencing them and taking their freedom of speech away. That is the soapbox. He goes on and says, however, we are going to stop them. We have definitely
had some setbacks with what happened in November.
Side note, losing the election.
We have had some setbacks with what happened last night in Georgia.
Losing the election again.
But we are not going to let the socialists rip the heart out of our country. We are not going to let them continue to corrupt our elections and steal from us our God-given right to control our nation's destiny.
No ballot box, no soapbox, no jury box. Are you ready to fight and die for your country today? I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah.
We've made that pretty clear. But that speech was then followed by Giuliani and Trump, was then followed by a riot that we talked about earlier that was an insurrection where they tried to kill the vice president they were purportedly there to support because he failed to overturn a democratic election. After a member of our government told them that if they did that, that would mean that they were supporting a dictatorship that would take everything from them. Take their free enterprise, take their freedom, take their guns, take everything.
Yeah.
I don't know, Michael.
I mean, I know they said that profanity or offensive messaging alone isn't enough, that the messaging must appeal to actions that lead to imminent violence.
Are you ready to lay down your lives?
Carl, the problem that I have with that is that if you watch his entire speech, as soon as he puts the mic down, he immediately walks off stage to a very loud rendition of Billie Jean by Michael Jackson.
USA, God bless America, and the fight begins today.
That does take some of the oomph out of it.
It does. And that crowd does not look moved at all. They're milling about. Some of them aren't even paying attention to him.
You know what might be a good consequence for him?
Yeah, what's that?
Maybe his portion of the legislative branch could vote to eject him.
I would say that he's acting in a manner that's pretty unbecoming of somebody in the United States Congress. Yeah.
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 Now, the main reason I wanted to read that is because, again, neither Michael nor I can say if that really passes the Brandenburg test. To Michael's point, the crowd does not seem particularly moved afterwards, which takes away a lot of the imminent lawlessness threat. And it took several more speeches to get them ramped up to the point that they stormed the fucking Capitol.
Yeah. It was really only after Trump said, let's go march down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue.
So let's also note then, if that doesn't rise to criminal incitement,
if you look at it all in the context of
Donald
today,
Trump almost certainly does not either.
No. I think that I think that Mitch McConnell is correct when he says that Donald Trump is morally and practically responsible for what happened.
Yeah, I just think he's incorrect when he says that they couldn't do anything about it.
Oh, that's
especially when we have multiple examples from history of impeachment trials finishing after the person was already out of office.
Yeah. He's wrong. And that didn't take, I'm not a constitutional scholar. That didn't take me long to figure out there's precedence for this. You're full of shit, Mitch. But what else is new? Ugh.
I guess one thing that's new is that MAGA's turning on him because he insulted their God King.
Yay. Maybe they can form a national unity party. Well, I guess where does that leave us?
I mean, I guess where that leaves us is they are probably going to get away with it.
Yeah.
And the thing is, they're going to get away with it because of the political cowardice of our senators. Mine, not yours, actually. They're going to get away with it because criminal consequences would frankly not be appropriate, and because the Senate refused to hold them accountable. Well, a minority of the Senate, but enough.
Yeah. And those 5 people that lost their lives did so in vain for lies.
Yep. And what we're left with is that we, the people, have to make sure that the appropriate consequence is levied. And the appropriate consequence is not being able to hold office again.
Yeah. Donald Trump 2024. I'm going to be posting this podcast again so we can all be reminded of what a fucking asshole you are.
And how badly you clearly abused the office to try to convince people that you should stay president even though you lost the fucking election.
Yeah. Whiny baby. Let's hope nobody else has to die because of Donald Trump's lies.
Yeah.
We'll see, though.
I mean, we'll see. There's still a lot to be cleaned up abroad from places where we pulled support out of.
Yeah. Well, here's hoping that Joe does a good job and does, I know he'll do a better job than Trump, and that bar was real low.
You're setting a high bar there, man.
Yeah.
High bar. But keep protesting Joe and push him left.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. We can all benefit from, and I'm going to use a scary word, more socialist policies. Universal health care. We need it. Too many people are dying from a pandemic that don't need to die. GoFundMe doesn't need to be our national health care plan.
Yeah.
Fuck. All right. I'll get off.
Man, that could be a whole nother podcast on how that shit's not actually socialism, and shut up and stop being scared of the communies.
Seriously.
It's not the 80s anymore.
It's not. Nonsense. All right. Well, that's our podcast. Hooray.
It is. Welcome back. Hopefully it will be less than a month and a half before the next one.
I'm looking forward to it.
And maybe
buddy.
a more fun topic next time.
Let's
like
not,
how to travel faster than light or some shit like that.
I would like that. Something more, with more levity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, all right, buddy. Until next time, let's do it again.
Yeah, until this time, let us know if there's anything you're interested in.
Yeah.
Correct us if we've fucked anything up.
Totally.
And
please.
keep on doing your research.